This message comes to you from King's Church Wirral, UK. We hope that as you listen, you will be encouraged, blessed and inspired.
Good morning. If you're new with us this morning, you will now be being informed by me that we are currently in the middle of spending a number of weeks looking through a written account of the life of Jesus of Nazareth that was written by a man called John. Now, John makes it very clear why he did this. He had a very clear purpose in mind, and that was to help people come to a decision about a key question. That key question is Jesus all he claimed to be? Towards the end of this biography that John wrote, he says this line. He says, "I have written these things so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and that by believing you may have life in his name." One of the themes of John's books is that Jesus performed signs in the presence of other people that showed that he was more than just a man. John tells us actually that he performed many miracles, but he goes into seven of these miracles in detail that he called signs. And the reason they're called signs is because they are about revealing or pointing to something about Jesus. Today we're going to be looking at a very famous story when Jesus feeds 5,000 people with virtually no food. It isn't a very long story. And because we've got some friends visiting today, I've asked their daughter Beth if she would be so wonderful as to come and read it for us.
Some time after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself.
As we've found out as we've gone through this teaching series in John, the details matter with John. John takes a moment at the start of this story to remind us that this was at the time of Passover. Now, Passover was a really important and very special time of year for the Jewish people. It still is. It was a time of national pride. Because in their history, Passover marked the beginning of them as a nation. Passover starts the story in Exodus of coming out of Egypt, receiving the 10 Commandments, walking the wilderness, taking possession of the Promised Land. Passover was to Israel what Independence Day is to the USA. Or October 1st, 1960 is to the people of Nigeria. I know that because we found out about Independence Day recently. This was the start of them as a people. Now picture what's going on, therefore, in a crowd of 5,000 men, which we can probably read as 5,000 families, or there or thereabouts, as they are walking. Now, if I was part of a crowd of about 5,000 people and we were just going for a walk, that's one thing. But if it was happening at Christmas, it's likely that along the journey, my kids would be asking me about what's going on at that time of year. And I'd be telling them the stories. And I'd be telling them the stories of Jesus in the manger. I'd be telling the stories of the shepherds on the hillside. I'd be telling the stories of the wise men. Because that's what you do at special times of year that mark history. So this crowd that are walking will have been telling the stories of Passover. They would have been telling their kids about the plagues that were visited on Egypt. They would have been telling their kids about the burning bush. They'd been telling them about Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea. These stories would have been the background chatter of the crowd as they walked along. This is what they would have been chatting about. And among that noise of stories, many would have been telling their kids and relatives about the time in that journey following the Passover when the people were in the desert and had no food. That would have been one of the stories they were telling whilst they were following Jesus. In Exodus 16, we can read this story about how the crowd of Israel are walking through the wilderness and they are grumbling against God and against Moses because they had no food. In Exodus 16, this line is, "Then the Lord said to Moses," this is what God's response was, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather for that day." Now, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time in Exodus because Exodus is not quite as succinct as John, and it's quite a long story in Exodus. But there are a few things I just want to draw our attention to. So, the story of manna in Exodus. Firstly, the people identified the problem of no food. That's the line. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. It was the people that identified the problem. Second thing, God told the people to only gather enough for their family for that day. It says this, "The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day." Third thing to notice, other than a special thing to do with the day of rest and Sabbath, there was only enough for them. There was only enough for them. If they tried to keep any, it would go rotten. There was only enough for right there, right then. And it said everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Now, in John's account of this sign, I use the U version on my phone, and the U version is really great because it's like naturally a red letter Bible. A red letter Bible means anything Jesus says is in red ink, and anything else is in black ink. So you can very quickly visually see how much Jesus is talking. And what's interesting about this passage is Jesus doesn't say much. There aren't very many recorded words of Jesus. In fact, he only says 3 things. Or his words are only recorded. It's recorded he said other things like giving thanks, but his words are only recorded 3 times. The first time, Jesus is the one who identifies the crowd's hunger. And he says, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" The second thing, so there in Exodus, the people identify the problem. In John, Jesus identifies the problem. In verse 10 of John, Jesus says his second thing, which is this: have the people sit down. So in Exodus, God instructs the people to go and gather, but in John, God instructs the people to sit. Finally, in verse 12, Jesus says, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So in Exodus, there's only enough for the moment. But in John, there is more than enough. There is overflow and there is more. See, Jesus is making a statement about himself through this miracle. This sign is not less than a blessing to the people. It's not less than a meal to a hungry crowd. That matters. But it is far more than that. And this wouldn't have been lost on the crowd, because they'd have probably, just before sitting down, have had large amounts of them telling the story of the manna from heaven, from Exodus. This would have been on their lips as Jesus is doing this sign. Now, these stories that the people would have been telling to one another will all of them lead up to a real key moment for the nation of Israel. The greatest act of grace that they experienced, that set them apart uniquely among all people. It's found in Exodus 20, and it's usually referred to as the 10 Commandments. For the people of Israel, these commandments and the accompanying law that went with them through the next few books of the Bible were an amazing blessing from God. They saw it as an outstanding act of grace to them as a people. They alone, unique amongst all people, had written down for them how to please God. That meant where everybody else was blind to God's desires, Israel knew them. They loved that. They held that precious. That was important to them. And as such, they alone had access to the life that God created for his people, the righteous life, because they'd been given a detailed blueprint in the law of how to live that way. Now, sometimes we can be, and it's through a New Testament eyes, we can be dismissive of the Old Testament law because we know that this side of the cross, the law was unable to achieve what they wanted it to achieve. They wanted it to be that they could be right with God by obeying the law. But we know from the writings of the New Testament that's not possible because you can't keep the law. But for the crowd, the law was beautiful because it was hope. It was the idea that it could be done. God had said, this is the way I want you to live. You can do this. And into that moment, Jesus rewrites the rules. Just as the manna from heaven in Exodus 16 is a story through that Exodus story that comes to life in God through the law, so this sign is a story on the way to the means by which life in God can be found. Just as bread was given to people in Exodus 16, so bread was given to people in John 6. And just as the law was given to people as a means to God in Exodus 20, the cross was given to people as a means to God in John 19. I heard somebody say, which I think is beautiful, and this goes through all the way through the Gospel of John. If the Gospel of John is the lyrics, the book of Exodus is the tune. I love that image. And you see it over and over. We've already looked at some of the signs. We haven't drawn all of this out. This is rich and deep. And we could be probably about another 6 years just looking at John. There's loads in there. But think about it. Think about what's gone on so far through these signs. Water into wine. Mirroring water into blood in Exodus. Healing of a firstborn, where in Exodus there was the death of the firstborn. John writes his gospel mirroring the Exodus story. And at this moment, he's picking this moment and he's placing it as a mirror to the giving of the manna from heaven. The nature of the way the bread was given in these two stories mirrors the nature of the God receiving method. See, the law that followed the manna was to deal with the problem that the people had. Now, just as manna was to deal with the manna was to deal with the grumbling of the people, and it was a reactionary thing. It started with the people. The people are upset. The people are grumbling. The people are hungry. The people are getting angry with Moses. God says they're upset. I'll give them manna. The people have sin. I'll give them law. Just as the law was based on human effort to achieve the goal, the manna had to be gathered with human hands. And just as the law was for Israel only, the manna was for that moment and that family only. This sign, therefore, says something of the way of Jesus. Because in this sign, the initial starting point was Jesus identified the need. Jesus identified the need. We can see that the cross is not a reactionary thing, but wholly on the initiation of Jesus. God saw the need and moved to meet it. Let me tell you today, right? God sees you. God moves towards you. And not because you are in crisis, not because you're a mess, not because you're screwed up or broken or any of those things. Those things may be true. I'm not arguing that we have challenges and we have brokenness in us. Those things may be true. That is not why God sees you. He's not reacting to your brokenness. He sees you because that's the way God is. He sees you because he chooses to see you. He sees you because he wants to see you. He sees you because you matter. And he doesn't see you only because you have grumbled against him. That was the way of the manna. That was not the way of the cross. Jesus instructs the people to sit down. There would be no requirement for you to work for this one. Nothing that the people had to do to receive it. No gathering, no toil, no sweat, no going out and breaking the back, counting the people, weighing it out, making sure I've got enough, is it going to go rotten? None of that. The cross is not something we have to earn or work for. It's something we can just sit down and receive because it's on Jesus. There were 12 baskets of food left over. The cross is extravagant. Some theologians, I don't want to get into heavy theology, some theologians, there is actually a big argument over whether the cross is wasteful. There's a big argument in theology over whether the cross is wasteful, because did it achieve something for people that would never receive it because they choose not to have it? Was it? I don't like to think of it as wasteful or not. I like to think of it as extravagant. I think that's a better word to describe it. It is over the top. It is beyond. It is more than. With the manna in the desert, there was only enough for then and there. With the bread in this sign, there was 12 baskets left over that could have dealt with and fed the entire nation. The 12 there being symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel. There was enough for everyone. In Matthew, this sign is actually in Matthew 14, I think. In Matthew 15, the sign is repeated, except for a Gentile crowd. And in the Gentile crowd, there's 7 baskets left over. And the reason there's 7 baskets left over is because there were 7 nations of Gentiles when they came into Canaan. So he said to the Jews, what I've got to offer you is enough for you now and for your entire people. And then he said to the Gentiles, what I've got to offer you is enough for you now and your entire people. It's more than, it's greater than, and it's bigger than. You know, this sign draws our attention to the new and better way of the kingdom that Jesus has ushered in through his death and resurrection. This new and better way, initiated by Jesus, not dependent on our working and striving for it, and sufficient for more than those who have received it. Now, I wonder if you actually know that. I don't mean could you answer a test on it. Sometimes we mistake to think knowledge is about getting the right answer. I do champions. They love getting the right answer. They love it. You say, what? Who do you think, Jesus? And I like to trick them, you know me, because it's not Jesus sometimes. Sometimes I make the answer someone else, and that gets them. But they like the idea of getting the right answer. They like the idea of knowing it, being able to explain it, being able to say it. But when it comes to something like, do you know that Jesus sees you because he chooses to? Do you get that? That's his heart towards you. He looks for you. Jesus didn't wait for the crowd to come to him and say, we're hungry. He looked up and saw a hungry crowd. He chose to look. Jesus chooses you. He chooses to know you. He chooses to be in your life. And all of that happens because he wants that. He's wanting that. Do you really know that you don't have to earn it or work for it? You know, that's not to say there's no virtue in effort. That's good. Effort towards what God is offering us is brilliant. But actually, you've just got to be willing to eat. You've just got to be willing to eat. Jesus saw that the people were hungry. You know, as I was just preparing this, I was thinking, what is your hunger? What hunger does God see in you? And I was reflecting on that idea. I was thinking, we sometimes talk in churches like hunger is a proactive idea. And we say, oh, be hungry. You know, I can tell you, not once in my entire existence have I ever managed to make myself hungry in a moment. Let's say I've just eaten lunch, and then I go around to someone's house, and they go, oh, I've made you some food. I can't at that point just go, okay, I'll be hungry. It's not possible. That's not how hunger works. Hunger exists because of a lack. Hunger exists because of a gap, because of something that hasn't been received, something that hasn't landed yet, something that hasn't come in. I can't tell you what you'd be hungry for. But I do know that you probably could answer that question yourself. You can probably know right now what it is that is your greatest desire from God. It might be anything from dealing with mental health conditions, that you are hungry for release from that. It could be for your children or your neighbours to get them to know Jesus. It could be that you are simply hungry for a passion that was once there and now seems like it hasn't been there for a while. You might be hungry for more of the Holy Spirit. I don't know. But it exists because there is a lack, and Jesus looks up and says, they're hungry. It's time to feed. Now sit down. I'm going to feed you. I wonder whether you really know that what God offers us through the cross is meant for more than us. It's meant for more than the people who accept it and pick it and choose it. On the fun day, we saw 350 people from our community come through our gates. As they came in, the crowds came in, we met them, they played our games, they bought our tombola, they looked at our building, they threw ping pong balls into cups, their kids got sweets. You know, as they came in, I have to say, I honestly felt an echoing of Jesus' first sentence where I looked and said, where on earth are we going to get bread to feed this crowd? Where are we going to get the bread to feed this crowd? And I meant it a spiritual way, to be clear. I wasn't thinking that the barbecue was going to run out. I meant, although the barbecue did run out, right? I don't mean that. I mean, I look at it and I was seeing people come in and there is brokenness on their faces. And there is heartache in them. And they are just clearly carrying themselves in a way that they are finding it tough. And I ask, where are we going to get the resource to meet that need? Well, the wonderful thing about this is Jesus knew the answer before he asked the question. And it says that in John, he says he only asked to test them. He already knew he was going to feed them. The kingdom of God, yes, it's for us, but it is for everyone. It is for the world. It is for our workplaces. It is for our unsaved friends. You know, me and my boss at work, we're both Christians. And the people on our teams, and I'm quite happy about this, I like this, the people on our teams say, you know what, I love being on this team. I've never worked in a place which is like this. And me and him sort of secretly give each other the eye and go, it's because you're experiencing the kingdom of God. You're getting one of the 12 leftover baskets right now. You're getting the overflow. We do kingdom, you benefit. I don't want it to end there with them. I want them to know Jesus. But it's for more than us. It's for more than now. It's for everything, everywhere. Sometimes we can lose sight of the everything, everywhere and the extravagance and all of that. Maybe we look at someone and they feel too lost. I have to say there were some people who came in on the fun day that I looked and my initial thing was, oh my word, I've got absolutely no idea how Jesus can break in there. I've got absolutely no idea. But the message here is he is able, and it is sufficient, and it is beyond, and it is more. Jesus is enough for people who have been hurt by church. Jesus is enough for people that have walked away from church. Jesus is enough for people for whom the message of the church is offensive to them. Jesus is enough for every circumstance and every situation. That's what those 12 baskets are all about. It's not just for us, it's for all. Somewhere along the way, just so we can absolutely land that John was right, because he said, I've recorded this so that you'll believe he's the Messiah. Somewhere along the way, the crowd realized what was going on. They'd probably been telling these stories about manna from heaven, and then they start seeing this miracle, and then they go, he's the Messiah. Right? That's what they do. And they try to grab him. And they tried to make him king of Israel. Now, Jesus escapes, and there's a whole thing about his escape, which is quite a lot of fun, and there's quite a lot of interesting stuff there. But the key thing here is, this sign convinced them that he was the Messiah. Does this sign convince us that he is the Messiah? Does this sign convince us that what God did through Moses to Israel to bring them to the law, God does through Christ, through the cross, to bring us to eternal life and the life in the kingdom? And what are we going to do with that if we do believe it? Because this was written so that we would believe Jesus was the Messiah, and that by believing we would have life in his name. Now I want us to pray and I want us to respond. I've got a slide for a few questions we could consider along the line on this. But really, I don't want to limit it too much. If you know God speaking to you, you heard the testimonies of what happens to people when they respond. Let's go for it. Father, I just want to thank you that your signs tell us something about you, that they are a demonstration of your power to this earth, and they were a demonstration of your desires for this planet, for its people, for all of creation. Lord, I want to thank you that just as you rescued Israel, you rescued us. But Lord, I want to thank you that the rescue of all people was greater. It was greater, it was bigger, it was better, it was more. And it was more than sufficient, but extravagant in nature. Amen.
We hope that you've been blessed by this message. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at www.kingschurchwirral.co.uk.